7 words that were always true about you. A Stoic rewrite there is a voice inside your head that has been talking for as long as you can remember. You did not write it. You did not audition it. You did not sign any document approving the words it says to you at 3 in the morning when no one else is listening and the entire country is asleep. You simply inherited it from fear, from failure, from a parent whose love was real but whose language was unusually cruel on certain afternoons. From a culture that quietly runs on the assumption that if you pause long enough to wonder whether you are enough, you will buy something to fix it. And right now, today, on the 7th of whatever month this happens to be, that inherited voice is running the entire program of your one and only life, and you have never once audited a single line of what it has been saying. This is not the script you were born with. This is the script that was installed while you were too young to look at the installer. And the worst part is not that you have been living inside it. The worst part is that the voice speaks with such intimate fluency that you mistook it for yourself for decades. Of course it sounds like you. It has had your whole life to study your accent. The ancient Stoics understood this with a precision modern neuroscience is still catching up to. Marcus Aurelius, who governed an empire during war, plague, and betrayal from his own family. Seneca, who was exiled twice to a desolate island by an emperor he had personally offended. Epictetus, who spent years in actual chains before he ever spent a single day free in his own mind. They were not men who wrote about peace from a clean library somewhere, undisturbed by the world they were describing. They wrote from inside the wreckage of their own lives, with their own unchosen fire still burning behind them, because they had no other place left to write from that would have been honest. What they eventually unearthed, after lifetimes of being broken open, is the same thing every serious student of the mind eventually finds. The words you speak to yourself are not decoration. They are architecture. They are the load-bearing walls of the house your thoughts wake up in every morning. And most people, right now, today, in this country, are squatting inside a house they were never consulted on the blueprint of. A house constructed out of other people's fears, other people's limits, other people's quiet definitions of what somebody like you is supposed to be capable of. Today, that ends. What follows is not 7 sentences. It is not 7 paragraphs you can skim. It is 7 words, each one a single syllable or 2. Each one carrying 2,000 years of tested wisdom, ossified in stone by people who had far less room for error than you have right now, and each one carrying the quiet power to dismantle, one by one. Every lie your mind has quietly accepted as truth for as long as you can remember. These words will not flatter you. Comfort flattens people. These words will cut you open, rearrange what they find inside, and stitch you back into a version of yourself your own mother would not recognize across a crowded room. And if you stay until the final sentence of this video, and I am asking for something specific from you, here I am asking for your full attention. Without multitasking, you will leave this place different than you arrived. Not because of anything I did, because of something that has been quietly waiting inside you your entire life for you to finally have the language to claim it. Let us begin. Word 1. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die. You just flinched. I cannot see you, but I know the flinching happened somewhere behind your eyes, because the mind always does this when it encounters the one idea it has spent its entire existence trying to dose itself out of. Stay with me. This is not a dark word. It is arguably the most liberating 4 syllables ever assembled into a single phrase by any human mind in any language in any century. Picture a paramedic in the back of an ambulance that is currently her own. Not somebody else's ambulance she is treating. Her own ambulance. Her own chart. Her own EKG. She has just read her own number. And in the strange silent half-second before her training kicks back in and her hands remember what hands are supposed to do in an ambulance, she sees, with the brutal clarity only the dying ever see, the entire shape of every choice she has been postponing for a decade, the conversation she owes someone, the walk she has not taken. The sentence she has been writing in her head for years that she has never once emailed. She did not want to see all of it. But the paramedic saw it anyway, because she is the paramedic now, and the chart is hers, and ECG does not negotiate with the patient's wishes. This is the gift hidden inside the word you are flinching away from right now. The Romans knew this gift 2,000 years ago. When a general returned victorious from a war chariot rattling through marble streets, crowds packed shoulder to shoulder along the entire route, the city stretched at his feet in a posture of permanent genuflection, there was a slave whose single assigned task for that entire procession was to ride beside the chariot and whisper 4 words in the general's ear, repeatedly, for the duration of the parade. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die, not to shame him, not to diminish what he had accomplished, to keep him human, to keep him present, to prevent him from mistaking the crowd's noise for evidence that he had somehow stepped outside the ordinary human condition and become exempt from the only condition there is. Because the Romans understood, with a clarity our age of infinite scroll and almost infinite distraction has forgotten, that when you forget the limited quantity of your time, you treat your time as though it were worthless. And when you remember, even briefly, even clumsily, even just once a day, you stop wasting it. Consider the last 7 days of your life. Sit with that for a moment, not as an indictment, as an honest inventory. How many hours did you spend in low-grade dread about events that never actually arrived, and may never arrive? How many evenings did you donate to a glowing rectangle you were holding 6 inches from your face, while privately assuring yourself that the full version of your life was still out there waiting for you on the other side of the next quarter? After the promotion, after the relationship became easier, after things calmed down. Things are not going to calm down. Tomorrow is a check you are writing on an account whose balance you were never told. Marcus Aurelius, the man commanding 30 legions and 60 million subjects in the 2nd century AD, wrote this to himself in the private journal he never fully intended for any other human being to read: "You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do, and say, and think." That is not morbidity. That is arithmetic. Because the moment you genuinely feel the weight of your own finite number of mornings, the nonsense collapses. The extended argument with the coworker who was never your problem in the first place becomes noticeably shorter. The anxiety about what strangers in a comment section think of your choices evaporates because you remember, suddenly, that the strangers were also going to die and you will never have to meet them in any actual room. The grand project you have been postponing on the excuse that it is not ready, it may not be ready. It will never be ready. Begin it anyway. Steve Jobs sat across from a doctor in an office he had entered expecting a different conversation, and said this afterward: "Remembering that you are going to die is the best way I know to avoid the trap of thinking you have something to lose." Modern psychology calls this terror management theory. The Stoics got there first, by a margin so wide that the empirical research is still, in some sense, playing catch-up with a journal entry written in the 2nd century. But the Stoics used the knowledge deliberately. They used it to live more, not less. To love more boldly, work more honestly, speak less wastefully. To stop bargaining with the temporary and start treating it as the only asset you actually possess. Say it this morning. Whisper it before your feet cross the floor. Memento Mori. Let it strip the fog from everything that is not real. The argument was not real. The opinion was not real. The fear you have been obeying for years, the one you have never even examined closely enough to name, was never as inevitable as your flinch made you think it was. You were going to die anyway. The only question left is whether the decades you have left will be spent flinchingly or on purpose. Word 2, Amor Fati, love your fate. Not tolerate it, not survive it, not optimistically phrase your way through it. Love it. I know what you are thinking. Love the diagnosis. Love the bankruptcy. Love the person who took everything when they left the room. Yes, and I will tell you exactly why. And the why is not philosophical. It is the single most practical survival tool ever surfaced from underneath the entire history of human thought. Friedrich Nietzsche, who spent most of his productive life in chronic illness, in professional rejection, in profound solitary loneliness, and in an eventual descent into a madness that swallowed the last decade of his mind, wrote a single sentence that may be the most quietly lethal sentence ever written by anyone who ever suffered that badly. My formula for greatness in a human being is Amor Fati. That one wants nothing to be different. Not forward, not backward, not in all eternity. Not merely bear what is necessary, still less concealed, but love it. That phrase, love it, is doing almost all of the real work in that sentence. The Stoics believed that everything that arrives is part of a rational, interconnected system. They called it the logos, and your resistance to what has already happened is not wisdom. It is waste. Pure, expensive, energy-burning waste. And the Stoics were, as a school, brutally honest about the math. Almost everything that has already happened is no longer up to you. Your resistance to it is costing you everything. Your refusal to find the purpose inside the pain is costing you the entire future the pain was supposed to lead you into. Consider the scale of what most people routinely burn on the inward complaint this shouldn't be happening. The traffic jam that shouldn't have been there. The career that should have gone differently. The body that should be working better. The family that should be easier. The relationship that should have lasted. The news cycle that should be less criminal. The list is endless. The energy bill is enormous, and it buys you nothing at all, because every last item on that list happened in the past, where you do not currently have purchasing power. Thomas Edison's laboratory burned to the ground in December of 1914. Every prototype, every notebook, every blueprint, 20 years of accumulated work destroyed in a single night. By sparks, by wind, by a kind of bad luck that no insurance policy was ever written to cover. He was 67 years old. His son found him at dawn standing in the courtyard, watching his life's work turn to ash. Edison turned to him and said, "Go get your mother and all her friends. They will never see a fire like this again." By morning, he had begun rebuilding. That is not denial. That is not toxic positivity plastered over the wound. That is a man who had trained himself deliberately and across decades to find what is useful inside what is broken. Edison was not lying to himself about the loss. The loss was real. The notebooks were gone. He had simply decided years earlier that he would be the kind of person who could recognize material when material arrived, even when it arrived as fire. Amor Fati is not about pretending things do not hurt. They do. They should. You are human. But there is a distinction the Stoics held with obsessive precision. And it is the same distinction the second lesson of an entire therapeutic tradition would later be built around. Pain is the event. Suffering is the story you keep telling yourself about the event. The endless loop of why me, this is unfair, everything is ruined, that you replay at 3 in the morning until the original event has been amplified into a catastrophe several times its actual size. Amor Fati is the moment you interrupt that loop. It is the moment you stop narrating the wound and start asking what the wound is making possible. What am I learning? What does this force me to become? What is hidden inside the wreckage that I would not have found any other way? Epictetus was a slave in a Roman household, owned by a man who broke his leg deliberately, in public, to prove a philosophical point about how much of a human being could be broken before the human being stopped being one. From that unbearable cruelty came the philosophy that would shape Marcus Aurelius, would shape the entire subsequent Stoic tradition, is shaping the conversation you are listening to this minute. The worst thing that ever happened to him became the most generous thing he ever gave the world, none of which is available to you until you stop arguing with the worst thing that ever happened to you. Say it today. Say it the next time something goes wrong, and something is going to go wrong. Definitely today. probably within the next hour. Amor Fati. I love my fate not because the fate feels good, not because the fate is fair, not because the fate was earned, but because I trust that I am being forged, not broken. The fire and the forge look identical from inside the fire. The difference is what you decide to do while you are still inside it. Word 3, discipline, not the discipline of motivation. The discipline of practice when motivation left the room. There is a particular kind of lie woven almost seamlessly into American culture, into every advertisement, every productivity headline, every motivational poster taped to a gym wall by someone who taped the same poster there 3 years ago and never once worked out in front of it. The lie goes like this: freedom is the absence of constraint. Do what feels right in the moment. Follow your passion. Trust the impulse. Reward yourself for showing up. The lie has destroyed more potential than any obstacle ever could. The Stoics believed the exact opposite, with a confidence that 2,000 years of subsequent evidence has done nothing to weaken. They believed that discipline was not the enemy of freedom. It was the only path to it. That the undisciplined man is not free at all, he is a slave to whatever he happens to feel in any given moment, which is the most demanding and least reliable master anyone has ever accidentally hired. No man is free who is not master of himself. Epictetus. Consider the people you have ever genuinely admired, not the ones who got lucky, not the ones who inherited anything, the ones who built something real, with their own hands, over years, by doing the unremarkable work on the days when the work was not, by any normal measure, fun, the undrafted runner who trained alone in a park before dawn for years before anyone in the room could have told you his name. The writer who finished the book no one had commissioned. The kind of book that only gets written by people who would still be writing if the entire publishing industry collapsed overnight. The surgeon who became a surgeon by practicing the same incision 10,000 times on materials that did not bleed. Marcus Aurelius woke before dawn to write. Not because the writing was pleasant, much of what he wrote in those hours was the same exhausted sentence he had already written the night before, because the problem he was examining had not yielded just because he was bored of it. He wrote anyway, because he understood that the practice of self-examination was more important than the comfort of being right. What the Stoics codified 2,000 years ago, and what modern neuroscience has been slowly confirming in laboratories ever since, is that the brain is not a fixed object. It is constantly under construction. Neuroplasticity is not a metaphor you are free to use however you like. It is a biological fact, complete with myelinated sheaths and synaptic pruning. Every choice you make is, at the physical level, literally rewiring the architecture of the organ that will be making your next choice. Every time you choose the difficult thing, you are thickening the pathway of willpower. Every time you choose the easy thing, you are thickening the pathway of avoidance. You are always building something. The question is what? A former Navy SEAL commander named Jocko Willink, decorated combat veteran and a man who has watched human beings discover what they are made of under conditions you have never encountered and sincerely hope you never encounter, distilled the entire Stoic position into 3 syllables anyone can remember in a single morning. Discipline equals freedom. The disciplined runner is not a prisoner to the road. He is free to run 10 miles on a morning when the undisciplined man cannot run one without outside motivation. The disciplined writer is not a prisoner to the page. She is free to finish the book the undisciplined person has been quietly fantasizing about starting for 11 years. The disciplined businessman is not a slave to his inbox. He is the only person in the room whose schedule is not being dictated by whoever screamed loudest that morning. What are you failing to be disciplined about right now? Not as a judgment, as a genuine question. Because that is the area of your life where you are least free. That is where life is happening to you, instead of through you. The Stoics had a practice they called ascesis, deliberate, voluntary self-denial. Marcus Aurelius occasionally slept on the floor. Seneca practiced voluntary poverty for weeks at a time, eating simple food, wearing rough clothing, not because he had to, he was one of the wealthiest men in Rome, but to remind the mind, on a regular and deliberate schedule, that it could survive without the comforts it had unconsciously come to believe it required. You do not have to sleep on your floor. But you do have to practice choosing the harder thing on a day when the easier thing is fully available and would have cost you nothing except your growth. Say the word today, not as a wish, as a commitment. Discipline. I choose it today, especially today, when the impulse to skip it will be loudest. Word 4 enough. Sit with that word for a moment before I say anything else. Enough. When did you last genuinely believe it? About yourself. Not as a slogan, not as something a podcast host said once in a moment of inspiration. About yourself. In the privacy of your own kitchen, with the dog watching, with no one else in the room to perform it for. When did you last actually feel that you were enough, exactly as you already were, right now, this morning, before you change anything? The economy you live in is engineered with billions of dollars. Behavioral research behind it to make that feeling impossible on any schedule longer than a few hours after a purchase. Every advertisement you have ever seen was constructed by someone whose only job was to make you feel, briefly and specifically, that you were insufficient without their product. Their car, their face cream, their morning routine, their planner, their vacation, their relationship template, their diet. The machine requires your dissatisfaction to function, and the machine has been running inside your head for so long that you can no longer distinguish in real time between a genuine aspiration you actually feel and an anxiety someone else installed on purpose. The Stoics called this trap false goods. Things the world told you to chase that had no actual capacity to make you whole. Money beyond the line of sufficiency. Status beyond the line of dignity. Approval from people whose names you will forget in 3 years. Pleasure beyond what the body genuinely needs, as opposed to what the advertising industry has spent 2 centuries trying to convince the body it needs. Seneca, who lived in one of the most expensive residences in Rome, who advised emperors on policy, who was, in any honest accounting, fabulously wealthy, wrote a single sentence that probably cost him more to write than any other he ever produced. It is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more. That is poor. He was not telling you not to want anything. He was pointing at the trapdoor that most people walk across every day without noticing the trapdoor that opens onto a destination that keeps moving as you approach it, because the destination was never a fixed point on the map in the first place. It was a mirage with exceptional marketing. Marcus Aurelius. In a journal entry that reads as though it was written specifically for anyone who has ever scrolled through someone else's curated success at 2 in the morning and felt a quiet, corrosive deficit open somewhere in the chest, wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." The most thoroughly researched populations in modern psychology, studied for decades in every continent where research funding was available, confirm this with the kind of empirical stubbornness that physiology cannot argue with. The happiest people in the documented research are not the wealthiest. They are the people who knew, at some point along the way, the difference between enough and more, and who had the moral courage to actually pick enough on purpose. Viktor Frankl survived the Nazi death camps. He lost. In sequence and without pause, his manuscript, his life's work, gone. His family, every single member, murdered. His freedom, his professional standing, his home, his name's meaning in the world outside the wire. When he was finally liberated, he had nothing left in his hands except his mind. And from that place of absolute nothing, he sat down and wrote one of the most consequential books of the 20th century, in which he observed, with the calm certainty of someone who had earned the right to make the claim, everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. That is a man who discovered enough. Not because the world gave it to him. Because, with the world stripped down to nothing, he had no other option but to claim the one currency that no one could take from him. Here is the practice. It is not positive thinking. It is not an affirmation taped to your bathroom mirror at a height you can barely reach. It is a single, honest question. If I already had everything I actually needed to begin living fully, not perfectly, not completely, but fully, what would I do differently today? The answer to that question is your real life. The life you have been postponing until some imaginary threshold of ready or worthy or finished. You were always at the threshold. You are still standing on it right now. Say the word. Mean it. Enough. I am enough, as I am, to begin. Word 5. Stillness. In a culture that measures worth by activity and treats silence as evidence of failure, stillness is a weapon. And almost no one has access to it. Consider the last time your mind was genuinely quiet, not distracted into artificial quiet by a screen or a substance or a stream of input dense enough to drown out the deeper noise beneath. Actually, quiet. Quiet enough that you could hear your own thought arrive, complete, uninterrupted, not the anxious chatter of a to-do list, not the looping replay of a conversation that ended badly 7 years ago. Something underneath all that, older and slower and more accurate than any of the surface voices. Most people have not experienced that kind of quiet in years. Most people are actively afraid of it, because in the silence, the truth usually arrives, and the truth is not always the version the world has been paying you to broadcast. The Stoics knew that all the clarity anyone has ever required already lives inside them. They understood that you cannot hear it over the noise. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are." This is not Eastern meditation. It is not mindfulness borrowed from a tradition the Stoics would not have recognized. It is something older, sharper, more stoic. They called it prosoc attention, a form of vigilant, disciplined self-observation that the modern reader might recognize as a primitive ancestor of the cognitive behavioral techniques that now have entire treatment manuals behind them. Not the pleasant half-hour where you breathe in for 4 and out for 6 and try not to think about anything. A rigorous, daily, often uncomfortable practice of watching the mind without allowing the mind to sweep you away inside its current. What am I thinking about right now, in this exact moment? Is this thought true? Is this emotion even mine, or is it something I absorbed from the room I just walked out of without realizing I had breathed it in? What does my wisest self, the version that is hardest to find when I most need her, actually believe about the situation I currently think is unbearable? These questions cannot be asked in noise. They cannot be asked while you are answering an email, while you are scrolling, while you are pretending to be present in a conversation whose actual content you have lost track of. The questions can only be asked in stillness. The answers only arrive in stillness. Every major leader whose decisions actually changed something irreversible was, at the moment of the decision, in some form of deliberate stillness. Lincoln in the cabinet, alone after the others had left and only the candle was still burning. Churchill in the bath, 3/4 submerged and utterly unreachable, dictating to a secretary waiting on the far side of the door. Newton in a garden, alone by the forced accident of a university-wide plague that closed the entire city around him, with nothing to do except sit still with his own thoughts long enough for the pattern he had been circling for years to finally show its face entirely. Newton did not discover gravity in a crowded marketplace. He discovered it because there were no markets open. He was alone in a garden, with nothing but his hands and a quiet mind and whatever fruit was hanging from the tree. That imposed stillness gave humanity calculus, the laws of motion, and the theory of gravity, in other words. Most of the mechanical framework the modern world is still operating inside, 2.5 centuries later. What would you discover if you gave your mind 30 minutes a day of genuine, undefended stillness? Not scrolling. not multitasking, not letting the silence fill itself with whatever auto played next, sitting with your own mind without giving it anything new to consume, letting the discomfort arise naturally, as it will, letting it pass the way discomfort passes when you refuse to feed it. And then, in the space that remains after the discomfort has passed through you, listening, that is where you actually live. That is where the version of you who is not reacting to anything is still waiting the version you keep interrupting before she can finish her sentence. The decisions you make from a place of noise, from urgency, from anxiety, from emotional reactivity, from comparison to someone else's highlight reel you just finished scrolling, those decisions are almost always wrong, or at minimum, smaller than they needed to be. The decisions you make from stillness are the ones that change the trajectory of a single ordinary life and possibly several lives downstream of it. Practice it tonight. 5 minutes. 10. Sit with your own mind without giving it anything to do. Let the silence do what silence has always done, what it did for Newton in the garden, what it did for Marcus Aurelius before dawn, and let it return to you whatever it returns. Stillness. Return to it daily. That is where your life is actually being lived, even when no one else can see it. Word 6, virtue, the most misunderstood four-letter word in the English language. It has been quietly neutered by centuries of religious association until it conjures, for most people, a vague image of someone unusually polite refusing dessert, someone careful, someone small, in a way that was probably intended to be virtuous and accidentally became the entire opposite. In the Stoic tradition, virtue arete in the original Greek had nothing to do with being cautious, and everything to do with being excellent. Fully, completely, ruthlessly excellent at being a human being. The Stoics believed in 4 cardinal virtues, not 10 commandments and not a checklist of minor prohibitions. 4 capacities, each of them inseparable from the other 3. Wisdom, the ability to see clearly. Courage, the willingness to act rightly, even when the cost of acting rightly is something you personally did not want to pay. Justice, the commitment to treating every other human being in your path as someone who deserves to be treated according to the actual content of who they are, not according to what they can do for you on a Tuesday afternoon. Temperance, the discipline to stop, voluntarily, before excess turns the excellence you were building into the ruin it was about to become. And here is the single most consequential claim in the entire Stoic corpus, the claim that separates Stoicism from every other philosophy you have ever encountered in any school, in any lecture, in any bestseller. These 4 virtues are the only genuine good. Everything else, money, status, health, pleasure, the body itself, the life itself is what the Stoics called preferred. Meaning, the rational person would choose it when it was available, but it is not required for a good life. You can lose every single preferred thing and still be living a good life, even on the last day of it. The 4 virtues cannot be removed from you by anything external, because the 4 virtues are not external. They are you, at your most accurate. Zeno of Citium, the founder of the entire Stoic tradition, was shipwrecked on the coast of Athens at the age of 30. He lost everything, every possession, every professional plan, every certainty about the future he had been quietly building toward. He walked, with nothing, into a bookshop on a coastal road, and he read, by accident, by what the Stoics themselves might have called the logos moving him, an account of the death of Socrates. And something cracked open inside him that had been sealed shut by the previous version of his life. He did not return to the old life he had been shipwrecked out of. He could not. The old life was buried under the sea somewhere. He began a new one. From that shipwreck, one of the most consequential philosophical traditions in human history was born. That tradition produced Marcus Aurelius. That tradition quietly shaped the founding documents of the American experiment. That tradition underlies the cognitive behavioral therapy now being prescribed in clinics across this country every single Tuesday afternoon. All of it. downstream from a single shipwreck that the previous version of Zeno's life would have called total ruin. Because Zeno understood, with a clarity his shipwrecked body could not have arrived at any other way, that what he had lost were externals. What he still carried within him, his capacity for reason, for examination, for virtue, for wisdom, was not external to him. It could not be drowned. It could not be shipped to Athens on the bottom of the ocean. It was still there, on the dock, in the rain, in the bookshop. Indestructible. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. Marcus Aurelius. This is not abstract. This is the most practical question you can carry into every situation you will encounter for the rest of this week. What would the wisest, most virtuous version of me do in this exact circumstance? Not what would make me comfortable. Not what would make the loudest voice in the room approve of me. Not what is easiest. What would the person I am actually trying to become do if she were already fully here, standing where I am standing, breathing the air I am breathing? That question, when you ask it honestly and without flinching from what comes back, when you sit with it in stillness until you can actually hear what it says, it is a compass. It has never once, in 2,000 years of documented Stoic use, pointed anywhere but in the correct direction. The world can take your money. It can take your job. It can take your health, your freedom, your reputation, in some instances the people you have loved the longest. It cannot take the choice of how you face what is happening to you. That is not consolation. That is the entire game. Virtue. Build it. Protect it the way you would protect the only photograph you have of someone you lost. Choose it, especially when choosing it costs you something, because that cost is not a punishment. It is the price of becoming someone whose character the cost itself is not large enough to break. Word 7 begin not tomorrow, not after you feel ready, not when the circumstances improve. Now this is the word that separates every single person who ever actually changed their life from every single person who merely intended to. It is not the smallest word. It is the most terrifying one. Because beginning means leaving behind the comfortable prison of potential. The prison where you are still possible. Still unlaunched, still protected by the excuse that you have not started yet, and therefore cannot have failed yet, and therefore the dream is still perfect, because it has never met actual reality. Beginning ends all of that, gently, permanently, and it is the only thing that makes anything real. The Stoics had a deliberate, codified practice for this moment. They called it the reserve clause. In Latin, hic rhodus, hic salta, though Marcus Aurelius preferred the Greek phrasing, act fully, commit completely, but hold in reserve the quiet understanding that the outcome of the action is not yours to control. Say it before you begin, I will do this. And if something outside my control prevents me from completing it, so be it. I will still have done the part that was mine to do. This is not passivity. This is the most active stance a human being can possibly take. You act completely, without attachment to the outcome. You do your portion of the work. You trust the system, the logos, in the Stoic phrasing to do the rest. You do the only thing you can do, and then you stand down, not because you have stopped caring about the outcome, but because you have correctly identified the boundary between what is yours and what is not yours, and you have refused to spend more energy than is yours to spend. Marcus Aurelius began every morning, despite the plague that had killed millions of his subjects, despite the wars on multiple fronts that had drained the treasury he had inherited intact, despite the betrayals from within his own family that any competent historian could have warned him about in advance, despite his own failing health, which had begun quietly, far earlier than he would have admitted to anyone still breathing. He woke up and began. He wrote, in the journal he maintained in those dark hours, at dawn, When you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. What do I have to complain of if I am going to do what I was born for? That is not motivation in the modern sense. That is a man who had found his reason, and then found a way to begin anyway, on a morning when the reason was not on the surface, on a morning when the reason had to be coaxed out from under several layers of exhaustion. Every single morning. Not because every day was a triumph, not because every day felt like it counted, because the practice of beginning every morning was itself the only thing that could possibly count, eventually, in the aggregate of an entire ordinary life. Nelson Mandela was given 30 minutes of reading a day, in a prison cell on an island at the southern tip of a continent, 27 years into a sentence that the government that had issued it had fully expected him to die inside. 30 minutes. He used those 30 minutes to become the man who, upon release, carried the moral authority to walk a country back from the edge of a bloodbath that every other prisoner of comparable circumstances had predicted for decades. That is what beginning does. Beginning with almost nothing. Beginning with what you have. From where you are. In the time you were given. Even the time is narrow, and even the resources are thin. What is the thing you have been saying you will begin? The book. The business. The conversation you have been rehearsing for 6 years and have not yet started. The practice. The apology that has been sitting in your chest since before you can remember. The honest life that you have been quietly building the floor plan for in your head, but have never actually started pouring the foundation of. You do not need more information. There is no information you are missing. You do not need a better plan. There is no plan that will ever be sufficient to begin. You do not need the planets to align. You do not need the fear to disappear. The fear is not going to disappear. The fear is going to keep producing very reasonable seeming reasons to postpone every morning for as long as you allow it to produce them. You need to begin. You have been given at minimum this one day, this one morning, this 1 hour, this one video, which you chose to sit with instead of 1,000 easier things. That choice is itself a beginning, the kind no one else will ever be able to take from you. But beginnings do not compound on their own. They have to be followed by the next beginning. And the next. And the one after that. The Stoics called it the practice. Not a destination. Not an achievement. Not a framed certificate you hang in an office to prove to other people that you have arrived at a place you can now stop working. A daily, ordinary, unremarkable practice of choosing, in each new moment, to be slightly more in alignment with who you already know you are capable of becoming. It is not glamorous. The journal entry Marcus Aurelius wrote the morning before a major battle looked almost exactly like the journal entry he wrote on a quiet Tuesday afternoon at home in Rome. Because the practice does not depend on the circumstances. The practice is the circumstances. 7 words. Memento Mori. Remember that you will die, and let that make everything else matter more. Amor Fati. Love your fate, not despite what it contains, but because of what it is making you. Discipline. Choose the hard thing, because the easy thing has never once, in the documented history of human ambition, led anywhere worth going. Enough. You already are. Begin from here, from exactly who you are. This morning, without further postponement, stillness, return to it every day. That is where you actually live, even when no one else can see you living there. Virtue. Build it. Protect it. It is the only thing in your inventory that cannot be taken from you by anything outside your own character. Begin. Right now. With what you have. From where you are. The version of you that has been waiting in the next room your entire life will not walk through that door on their own. They are waiting for you to open it. The Stoics were not optimists. They did not believe the world was fair. They did not believe effort always produces the outcome the effort deserved. They believed something rarer and more useful. That the quality of a human life is determined not by what happens to it, but by what it does with what happens to it. They believed, with 2,000 years of tests behind the claim, that the house your mind lives in can be rebuilt. By you, from the inside. One deliberate choice at a time. One honest word at a time. One ordinary morning at a time. You have always known this. Somewhere beneath the noise and the conditioning and the accumulated weight of every voice that was ever louder than your own, you have always known this. Today is not a special day. It is an ordinary day. And ordinary days taken seriously, one at a time, are all that any life anywhere has ever been made of. Make this one count. Not for anyone watching. Not for the algorithm, for the person you were always capable of becoming. They are waiting. They have been waiting patiently for what may feel like your entire life. They will not wait forever. Begin.